So in the past 2 weeks, Ricardo covered some basic concepts in biology. I'm just in evolutionary biology. I'm going to go over them again. And in the meantime, if you have any question, just type it in the chat or raise your hand. So first of all, the very definition of evolution, which is kind of tricky, because in the general terms, evolving simply means changing. But in evolutionary biology, it has a slightly more specific meaning. The meaning being that it's a change in the heritable properties of populations of organisms over several generations. So anything that is not heritable is immediately excluded from evolutionary processes. It can't be subjected to evolution, as far as we know, and it should happen at the population level. Um, Otherwise, an individual can't be selected against, because if you select against an individual, you're just rid of the individual, and there's nothing to replace. So there should be a variation available for you to select from, and that variation is, of course, available at the population level. And also, it takes time for evolution to occur. It can't happen during someone's lifetime. So, unlike physiological changes, evolutionary changes usually happen over, usually in the case of uh, eukaryotes and animals, hundreds and thousands of years and millions of years for major transitions. But thankfully, our examples where evolution occurs in much shorter period of time. So one example being of viruses. In the case of viruses, since they really do a lot of basic biological functions, they are parasites after all. They entirely depend on their hosts to provide proteins and other biological substances. They can undergo changes penalty for it. So in this case, this is a plot presented in the class before. HIV virus from a patient. So it's showing the evolution of the HIV virus within the patient while the disease is progressing. So it's not from one person to the other. It's just one person became HIV positive, and over the in his or her body, they have been evolving. And as you can see, on the y-axis, there's a genetic distance. So it's genetic distance between different viruses in the body of that single individual. And lines, as the green line shows, showing the level between human and chimpanzee, around 2%. Early on, before the average genetic distance between viruses within the individual grew bigger than the distance between human and chimp, two different species. And after 12 years, there's 10% genetic differences between the individuals within the person. So that's an example of a very rapid evolutionary change happening over several years. So it's pretty unusual, since most changes occur over longer periods of time, but in this case, it is a virus, and really constrained by a lot of biological um, demands, it could evolve pretty fast. So far clear. So the evolution, you need a time, and you need heritage. The evolution is usually described evolution as such. So it's the idea of change that occurs in organic uh, entities. So that's usually the evolution. There's a specific, which is actually close to my heart because that's the topic I've been studying during my PhD. Speciation is the process of getting new species, starting from a single one, ending up with two. It's a process of bifurcation, to be technical, meaning that you start from one ancestral um, species, you end up with two species that are different, but both of them descended from the same ancestor. Natural selection, the driving force of evolution. Gradualism, meaning that changes occur gradually, not suddenly. A common ancestry. If you have a speciation, one point end up in start with old organisms present and then connect them to their common ancestry. You just get a almost interminable list of common ancestors until you get to the very first common ancestor. And there are other mechanisms aside from natural selection that shape organisms that we are actually going to genetics part of the class. Now, there has always been a question of why it took so long. As I'm sure you know, On the Origin of Species, the book by Darwin, published in 1859, that's quite recent, and one might wonder why it took so long. And there are different reasons for it. There are a multitude of books written on this very topic, but it's usually attributed to people not knowing biology. Um, People didn't know very much about the age of this planet, so a lot of them assume that the planet has been around for a few thousand years. So, in their view, there hadn't been enough time for evolution to occur. Uh, there's the idea of essentialism, um, which is actually kind of a tricky idea. It's a very old idea. The idea of essentialism basically means that when you ask people to think of a fox or a tree or a triangle, they don't really think of variations, they think of a quintessential. Uh, the idea of essentialism basically means the idea of essentialism basically means that when you ask people to think of a fox or a tree or a triangle, they don't really think of variations, they think of a quintessential entity that is the fox or the tree. Uh, so hopefully the audio and video is all right for everyone. So the idea of essentialism is practically just the idea that people intuitively don't grasp that there is variation. Oh, there's audio and video lagging for everyone. Mhm. So, is it better now? presumably, eventually, you could get two different species. So it is plausible. But it is very complicated as well. But this is a plausible scenario. Any other question regarding adaptation? All right. Lastly, two types of selections that we should understand juxtaposed with natural selection. So natural selection is what happens in nature. Populations evolve and they are selected to perform better in an environment. Artificial selection, though, uses the same idea and the same principle, but you are selecting for something. So in the case of pigeon fancying, which is something that Darwin um, actually participated in order to understand selection better, natural selection better, and also used as an argument in his book, a pigeon fancier selects for something and breed pigeons in order to get that trait. So, for example, if you want a very long neck or very bright plumage, you pick individuals with bright plumage and then you breed them, and you, from the offspring, you pick the ones that have bright plumage, and you use them to create the next generation, etc., etc., until you get what you want. So there's a human factor selecting for the trait in question, while you are using the principles of natural selection, namely the fact that there's a heritability involved and individuals have different uh, uh, degrees of reproductive success. But in this case, you are imposing the differential reproductive success, not the environment. And also, you are selecting for the trait. And people who, I mean, you probably have seen dogs that are entirely, they seem totally non-functional in any biological sense, but they have been bred uh, because the breeders could select for the trait they wanted, even though those dogs, once released in nature, cannot really do anything, cannot survive for long. So that's artificial selection. So you have heritability, you have trait, but in this case, the trait that is being selected for is picked by someone, an individual, and the reproductive success is determined by that individual because she picks the offspring that carries the trait of interest. Jennifer asks, are these pigeons or different species? That's actually a very difficult question to answer because so we have, I think we have 15 different definitions of a species in biology. Generally speaking, though, you consider these different variants of pigeons to be members of the same species because potentially they can mate with each other and produce offspring that are viable. In the case of actually domesticated dogs, that's even more problematic because in those cases, sometimes the breeders ended up having, some dogs are quite huge and some have been selected to be tiny. And so in those cases, you might ask, well, potentially they can mate, but physically they can't. So are they different species? No, and the answer usually is no, but they are different variants within the same species, since they have the potentials. As I said, they have the potential to breed for the most part and produce offspring that are viable and not sterile. So you can think of this. So the most intuitive definition of a species is a biological species concept. which actually we are going to cover later in this semester. But that idea is based on the concept that, or based on the rule that different species, when they mate, they produce offspring that are sterile or inviable. So, for example, horse and donkey, when they mate, they produce an offspring, a mule or hinny, depending on if the horse is male or female, but they are sterile. Artificial for heritable traits. Yes, artificial selection. For artificial selection to work, you need to pick traits that are heritable. Otherwise, you can't improve upon that over generations. So if you're picking for bright plumage, if that trait is not linked to a gene, over time you can't just make them brighter, because at every generation you're going to start from scratch, since there's a phenotype totally decoupled from the genotype that you're selecting for. Experimental evolution, though. So we talked about natural selection is one of the key components of the theory of evolution, introduced by Darwin himself. You have artificial selection, where you have an agent, is a human usually, selecting for a trait. But in addition to that, since starting like 30 years ago, people realized that you can actually have experimental evolution. The difference between experimental evolution and artificial selection is that in artificial selection, you don't really allow nature to do things. You want your desired outcome. You want a mastiff, you want a bright pigeon, and you want to get to that no matter what. You're going to breed and select for that. In the case of experimental evolution, the goal is more scientific, in that you want to have evolution, but you want to have it in a lab. You want selection to work, but you want it to be observable. And the most famous example is the Lenski experiment. Actually, parts of Lenski experiments is still going on in his own lab, but also even in our university. There's Tim Cooper in the Department of Evolution and Ecology is still working on bacteria from that line, from the Lenski experiment, and also they're still evolving in his lab as well. So the idea here is that you allow bacteria to grow in a constant environment, or a changing environment, depending on what you want, and you just allow them to grow. You transfer them to a new medium, and then allow them to grow again for a day, transfer them, allow them to grow. So in this way, you just allow them to adapt and evolve without really selecting for a specific trait, because you want to see how evolution works. The difference being that here you can freeze the bacteria at any point in time, so you can have, if you were to ask what was the genotype a year ago, you can just take the sample from the freezer, thaw it, and sequence the genome to see what was the genome back then in comparison to what is evolving right now in the tube